Just get underway with the right. Okay, sorry, hang on. It's just taking a while to get underway here. Oh, there we go. That's it. Okay, sorry about that. Just getting underway. So, Browne's Hospital in Stamford. It's described by Pevsner in the Pevsner as one of the best medieval hospitals in England, and it is really a remarkably complete survival. It was founded in 1475 by William Browne, a rich wool merchant of Stamford, his local town. It provided accommodation for 10 poor men and 2 women, under the supervision of a warden and a confrater, very much a communal living pattern. I want to say just a little bit to begin with about hospitals, just to set the broader context, and I'll come back in the course of the talk just to say a little bit more about other hospitals and how Browne's Hospital fits into that pattern, really. But it's a very distinct type of building. Term hospital, of course, in the medieval period was very different from our modern idea of a hospital where you go for medical attention. Hospitals in the early medieval period, from the 12th to the early 14th century, tended to be large institutions providing short-term accommodation often, or care for travellers, pilgrims, the sick, and of course some leper houses and so on. There were some that provided longer-term care for the poor or elderly. They're often really very large establishments, very strongly religious in character, and had similarities to a monastic setup. In the later Middle Ages, as when Browne's Hospital was established towards the end of the 15th century, the main focus of hospitals was as almshouses for the poor, the infirm, and the elderly. They were usually by this time much smaller institutions than the large early establishments. And it's thought that around 400 or 500 hospitals of the various sorts were in existence in the medieval period, the bulk of them founded actually before 1350. There were then huge losses of hospitals around the Reformation, of course, and during the 17th century, there was then a major move to establish almshouses, the later type of hospital. You'll probably recognise this from your own experience of historic towns, and of course, you know, your capital, Norfolk, Norwich, is distinguished by several buildings of this type, I'm sure. So it's a familiar pattern. When the occupants had duties to say prayers, they were also known in latter times as bead houses, because of the rosary beads that name comes from. So in the late 15th century, Browne's Hospital is referred to as all three: a hospital, an almshouse, and a bead house. So that's just a general sort of introductory, really, to set the tone, the overall context. This is a nice historic engraving of Browne's Hospital in Stamford, from Peck's History of Stamford, 1727. Just to introduce the building, we'll be looking at the various parts of it in quite some detail as we go through, but there's a main front block that we're looking at here with a dormitory on the ground floor, in here, a chapel, this double-storey element to the east end here, and a fine hall up on the first floor known as the audit room. There were some alterations in 1870. The front block survives, but the whole of the rear part was actually swept away at that time. But there is quite good evidence of that, in particular, as we'll see some photographs and actually a very detailed survey that was published in Dolman's set of engravings of historic buildings. So it does make a remarkably complete study. That's the talk of the title of the talk as an almshouse establishment, is between the building, the documents, the surviving information, and so on. You get a remarkably complete picture of the whole, the way the whole thing was set up, how it functioned, and the surviving fabric that goes with that. The talk is based on some quite detailed research that I did. I don't know if any of you know of Professor Alan Rogers, who sadly died couple of years ago now, he drew me into a study of this. He'd got very interested in it has a really quite substantial surviving documentary records, which he'd been studying for some years, and I joined him to look at the fabric of the building. So did a new study of that. It's been covered by the Royal Commission and so on as well. But as ever, when one looks closely at the fabric, one finds out new things. So we covered out and put it together extensive documentary research in the hospital archives and the new details study of the building. So Alan Rogers and I produced this short booklet a few years ago on it, and some major discoveries really about the function and the use of the building, and so on. So look then at this is the print from Dolman's. Move up there a bit. Yeah. Dolman's recording of the building, this wonderful set of plans, very complete set of, as we'll be seeing, plans, ground and first floor plans, elevations and sections, which give you a remarkably complete set of the building. The front block then over here surviving onto the main road, but much changed at the back here, so we get a very complete view. So we'll start then with the history of the foundation. The first section of the talk is about that. Founded then by William Browne, and also his wife Margaret Browne was also quite a key player in this. She features also in the record, and she's in the account book as the second warden. It's founded initially as Claymont Hospital, and this is the brass of William Browne and his wife in the church. William Browne was born in Stamford around 1410. He was son of John Browne, a draper. The Brownes had been leading Stamford family for since the mid 14th century. He's a very typical, leading figure of his time, really. He served as alderman of Stamford 6 times, the first in 1435. He was a wool merchant, joined the Calais staple, became mayor of the staple in the 1470s. Alan Rogers had this rather nice phrase in the book that he said he was obviously a very able man and rose to the top of any organisation that he seems to have joined. He was also alderman of many of the Stamford guilds. And he was also a very substantial builder. Besides Browne's Hospital, he rebuilt with his brother John the parish church of All Saints, which is just down the road from Browne's Hospital. That's it there. He also built a guild hall for the Guild of St. Catherine, which is now lost. And John Leland, in his great history of from the 16th century, describes him, a wonderful phrase, as a merchant of a very wonderful richness, which does obviously sum him up. He's a very successful merchant and businessman. That's his merchant's mark, the B for Browne there, which features in the stained glass at the hospital. It had a rather protracted foundation period and quite an intricate and intriguing history, which Alan Rogers in particular unpicked in the book. I'll just be able to touch on the sort of headlines of it really here. It seems to have been in operation initially from around 1475, though the earliest definite reference is 1479, when Mass was being said in the hospital chapel. In 1485, William Browne obtained a royal license for the hospital to become incorporated, quite an important feature and one of the reasons why it survives, really, and set up endowments to support it from his extensive estates. But the foundation was not completed, perhaps because of the death of Richard III. He actually paid quite a substantial sum, which then he had to argue that he had paid after the death of Richard III. And when Henry VII took over, he got into discussions about having to pay it all over again. William Browne died in 1489, and his wife Margaret died a few months after him. And the founding of the hospital was then taken up by his brother-in-law, Thomas Stokes, the husband of Margaret, his wife. He was quite a major figure, a canon of York and a rector of nearby Easton-on-the-Hill. And there's his, again, we have his rather wonderful glass. It's a punning thing, as you can see there. Just try and move that off. Is that? So it's the stalk for his Stokes reference to that, and then his motto, Christ speed me along. So there we go. He renewed the license, which was finally obtained in 1493, and the endowment was concluded soon after in 1495. It was quite a rich endowment. The establishment was allowed to hold property worth up to 50 marks a year, £33 or so. They put it in the sort of upper league of such sorts of establishments. And then in 1494, Thomas Stokes drew up the statutes, and the chapel was rededicated probably by the Bishop of Lincoln. So it was quite a lengthy process, and it does sort of show really how it was quite complex, often the founding, and to put it on a sort of permanent basis with a longevity to it was by no means straightforward. As I say, it's a remarkably complete building, and this, amazingly, is the brass plaque from 1497 that is fixed to the wall in the main entrance corridor as you go into the building, and is the original thing. There's in the documents, it's recorded that 3 shillings and 4pence was paid in 1497 to the marbler, that's the word for engraving, for the plate of Latin. The Latin is the brass here, which on this is recorded. We'll look at the detail of this inscription a little bit later on. But the point really is that this rather protracted establishment of the hospital as an independent, incorporated body paid off in the end. Many religious or guild hospitals, or those too closely associated with chantry type usage, were eliminated during the Reformation when chantries and such like all became verboten. But Browne's Hospital survived, though a new charter did have to be obtained in 1610 and re-establish it once again. So we'll come back to this nice engraving view, and I'll just talk a little bit about the statutes which survive and set out very clearly the way the hospital was run and its purposes and so on. It's like a number of other hospitals. The statutes survive, and they do give these great insights into hospital life. It was very definitely Browne's hospital for poor people, stated right at the beginning of the statutes. 10 poor men, 2 poor women. They were to be single, not married, and they are to be, in quotes, lowly, devout, and poor, and not having any other way of getting a living. So that's the way it was. The number of 12 was quite a popular size for such establishments by this date in the late medieval period. Some were 13, some were a bit smaller. Each of the inmates was to receive 7 pence per week for their maintenance. And if any of them came into a living of 4 marks per year, then they had to leave. So it was really quite prescriptive in terms of definitely being poor. Unlike some other hospitals, which provided, for example, for elderly brethren of a guild, the famous one at Winchester, St. Cross Hospital at Winchester, for example, provided for the noble brethren, as they were called. Well, these people were definitely poorer people at Stamford. They were also to be, in quotes, sick, weak and helpless poor, and they were to be diligently looked after by their fellows who are healthy and strong, and especially by the women, I'm quoting here. And a nice phrase which gives a very clear idea of how it was, what sort of establishment was it. If anyone, again in quotes, shall become leprous or infected by any other infirmity repulsively noisome to his or her fellows, he was to betake himself to some other place where he may be admitted. So yes, coming back to that idea of hospitals being for the sick or whatever, well, not this one. This was could only deal with you if you were sort of able to be managed in this environment. But if you did have to go off to somewhere where you needed more intensive care, then you did actually continue to receive your 7p a week. So that was quite good of them. And then the place of the women, it's quite interesting. The emphasis obviously on men, a specific statute about the duty of the women, which, to quote again, they should so bear themselves in washing and other things befitting honest women, and brackets so far as is decent, be altogether attentive and useful to the poor men in their necessities. So quite a division of the sexes and the duties thereon. I think the poor women had a rather harder time of it, didn't they, than the poor men. So this then is the brass plaque that we looked at, and there's the Latin and a sort of fairly free translation of it there. Which brings out really that the major activity and the dominant character of the hospital, of like so many of the period, and especially the earlier period, which is emphasized very strongly in the statutes and here, is that it was a house of prayer, a Maison Dieu, or Domus Dei, as it was often called. And on the last line here, you'll see it says Domus ista precum, that house of prayer. So that's what it was. The warden and the confrater were priests, also single, and so it's quite sort of monastic, really, in some ways, in its devotion to religious performance. So there was mass every morning at 7 o'clock in the chapel, with 3 services on Sundays in All Saints Church, just down the road, about 100 yards or so. Daily service at 2 p.m. with prayers for the souls of William and Margaret Browne, Thomas Stokes after his death, and their families. Another requiem mass on Wednesdays and Thursdays. The poor were also to go into the chapel and say a series of prayers for the souls of the deceased, first thing in the morning and last at night. Interestingly, manual labour was also forbidden. Maybe they thought that it would conflict with the concentration on prayer. So it's clear that, as in many medieval hospitals, the institution acted not just as a house of prayer in general, but as a chantry, specifically for the benefit of the souls of the founders, to speed them on their way through purgatory in that medieval belief. And there's lots of chantry chapels, of course, the same sort of period that were then abolished at the Reformation and the Chantries Act of 1547 and so on. But Browne's, as we've said, because of its establishment, managed to survive, and having been incorporated and separating itself probably enough from this connection of praying for people's souls. It was run, though, as a disciplined and closed institution under the warden and the confrater, backed up by the patron, initially Thomas Stokes. The poor had to maintain good behaviour. The gates were locked at night. Overnight absence without due cause was punished with fines or eventually expulsion. And again, we actually have the original chest. This is the chest where the warden was to render an account each year to the patron. A chest for the hospital's documents, their common seal, money, and other valuables. And you'll see here, rather similar to parish churches and so on, there are 3 locks here for 3 keys, one held by the patron, one held by the warden, and one of them very equitably by one of the poor men as well. So things were to be done above board and so on. So moving then on to the building, that sort of gives the general position in terms of what we learn about how people, how the hospital was set up, and the statutes and the lifestyle engaged in. The building itself then, this is a nice aerial view from the RCHM of Stamford. This is Browne's Hospital over here, Broad Street leading, one of the principal streets right in the town. This is the Church of All Saints, which we talked about, which Browne also rebuilt, and his own house actually was on this adjoining plot. That's lost now. So, but this is the whole centre of the high street here and so on in town. So it's a little bit on the edge of town, running up against the town wall there. And here's the frontage of it that we saw earlier on. It has this really quite well preserved front, and we'll be saying quite a bit more about how that's balanced, but you'll see this row of smaller windows on the ground floor. That's where the dormitory is, the very tall windows marking the double height chapel, and then larger windows on the first floor for that the fine room on the upper floor, which is a particularly intriguing space, which we discovered a bit more about its original purpose, as I'll be saying. One of the major changes that has happened to this building is that the porch over here on the left has actually been entirely rebuilt and moved across sort of one bay. If we go back, if we go to the oh, sorry, I'll just talk about the rear first. Yeah, so that's the front. Moving around to the rear, you can see it's very much the sort of rear face of the building. You've once again on the ground floor got the small windows for the dormitory cells on the ground floor. Just one large window on the upper floor. This block here is the stair leading up to this grand space on the first floor. And then we've lost over here, there was an abutting building here. We'll be looking at that later, but that was actually the warden's house coming in. Where this buttress now is, there was actually a wall abutting there, and the warden's house, one of the parts that was demolished in 1870, used to be there. You'll see it's quite odd looking in some ways, the building, and there had even been theories that the building had been converted and constructed in 2 phases, or that a first floor had been inserted and so on, which was something that I was able to dismiss really when we looked at it in detail, and as we'll see, sort of it all fits into a clear pattern, although not necessarily immediately obvious. I want now to just talk a little bit about the ground floor. Then this is the original ground floor plan from when it was still acting as a hospital, with the this row of there's 10 cells here for the poor men, and the chapel at the far end here. There's this screen area in front and so on, like a rood screen we'll be seeing here. And originally the porch that we see in the photographs was on this side, and there was a separate passageway leading in to the buildings behind in the courtyard. That's been rebuilt in more recent times. This is the Royal Commission plan. So the porch and that bay to the left has gone. It used to be here. It's been sort of made into here, and this passageway has been cut out of the main building. So there's been that small change. It doesn't change things hugely, but what it does make clear is that the dormitory was just a bit larger, and it had at least slightly different circulation pattern to it. The plan form of this type of hospital, which is a very standard type that's used particularly in the early medieval period and at some extent later on, as with Browne's, is called an infirmary hall plan, where you have the main infirmary hall here with the main sleeping area for all of the inmates and so on, and then directly towards the east of that, obviously, is the chapel, so that they're very much in the presence of God. It's very much part of this religious establishment. So looking at that as it is now, we're here standing sort of towards the entrance end, looking up the length of the dormitory and towards, it's almost as if you're looking through the screen in a church and towards the chapel at the far end with the altar there. So this is the space. There's been some changes here. If you look in the floor, when the major change was made after that Dolman drawings of the just before the changes of 1870, there was still the partitions here. And there's lines been left to indicate those in the floor here, and the windows, the small windows that we saw, sort of very much pick up the pattern of those 10 cells, small partitions. These partitions were originally, it seems, judging from the Dolman views, they were partitions. Early hospitals often were just divided with curtains and so on. They were often then became more established, built up in timber or even brickwork. And by the time of the 19th century dolmen engravings, the partitions rose right up to the ceiling. But they may not have done that originally, because there's no evidence for that in the beams. There's been some changes to the beams. These decorative braces and corbels are part of the Victorian work after this had been the beadsmen had been moved out into the adjoining accommodation, and this became a meeting space and so on instead. And originally, the partitions, it seems, didn't rise to the ceiling, but then later in the dolmen period they did. It's quite interesting, this, in terms of unpicking just to what extent this was a space of communal living, because as with the sort of history of halls and hall houses and so many other buildings, also monasteries, in hospitals, one moves gradually from the earlier medieval period to a sort of a very much shared communal space where everybody lived in the one space all together, to more and more privacy and separation of spaces, and that's very much part of the story of many. But in Browne's, this infirmary hall pan was really quite established, and interestingly, sort of somewhat backward looking, really. It was beginning to fall out of favour, and many hospitals, as we'll see one or two other examples shortly, were getting more subdivision, really. This having everybody in one space altogether is quite intriguing. So we'll just move on to the next slide. Yes, that's the detail of the moulding beam and brace, which is that's all a later application from the Victorian period. So one has to think that away and think of a rather plainer space with just chamfered beams and partitions and cells. Interesting, there's a little bit more in the statutes about this, just how sort of much it was communal and how much they had their own private space. The statutes say that each of the 10 said poor men should have one room separate to himself. So the cells did seem to have been able to provide full privacy, as indicated by that, and that when they were repairing or mending their own necessaries, the occupants should do this, in quote, secretly in their own rooms. So secretly often meant sort of privately, really, rather than it being, a sort of something that you were hiding secrets from people. But they had their own private spaces, even if it was fairly small little cell. And anyone who was not able to get to chapel for the services should say the same prayers in his or her chamber. But one thing they didn't have in that space is this, which was added later, when it only still didn't have a fireplace in the dolmen engravings period right up to 1870. Might perhaps have had a stove by then, but this was added then. So this was an unheated space, and we'll come back to that in terms of where else they were able to spend their time later on. Quite medieval and monastic, really, in some ways. There's then, intriguingly, this passageway, the cross passage that goes across, separating in some way, well, at least in circulation terms, the dormitory from the chapel. So here we're looking across the passageway. There's this open screen, a bit like a spear truss in a medieval hall, but doesn't seem to have had any doors or closure on it. So to the right, over this way, that's where the dormitory is, and then the chapel's over to the left with a very elegant carved screen. So here we're looking now, standing in the chapel, looking back through what has every appearance of a church screen down towards the dormitory, and you can see some very fine carved woodwork there. Really wonderful features here. The chapel itself is a wonderful double height space with you can see there the roof. It has a cambered lead roof, the original roof space as well, and rather fine glass. Originally, the blank east wall there had another fine window in it, which is shown in the dolmen engravings, but that the plot next door was then developed, and that was blocked up. So there's the screen there, looking back that way. There's a gallery now that's been inserted above there, but originally that was not there, and that seems to have been added on probably in the 17th or 18th century. But there's also this extraordinarily fine glass in the windows, and we'll see some more of this on the first floor. There's been quite a lot of research on the glass, and I think I can't recall this in detail, but I think there was some involvement possibly from some glazier from Norwich on that. It occurs to me suddenly now, should have checked on that. But you can see the close-up detail here. It's particularly noted by sort of specialists in glass for having these jewel-like enclosure pieces, sort of studs in it, which is quite a specialized and expensive technique of this 15th century period. I just now wanted to look at, we're looking briefly at the first floor, but actually really just looking at this chapel space, because what I wanted to bring out here, which you can with the eye of faith now, if you know what you're looking for in the chapel, you can see that this is actually the warden's house adjoining over here on the this part over here. And there's this little squint window with a splay, which is clearly for the warden then to be able to participate from his first floor chamber and look down towards the main altar here. So very much part of the way it was managed. Coming back to the chapel itself, there's this fine set of benches here with misericords and so on. Interestingly, there's just 6 of those, so there's some question mark really. We have the 10 poor men and the 2 poor women. Were they, maybe they didn't actually get into the chapel, maybe they were out in that passage space beyond, and that this was for other higher up dignitaries coming into the chapel, the patron members of the guild or whatever. But it's a very fine carving, as you can see, as you see in this often in this later medieval period, misericords and so on, all really beautifully preserved. Rather fine stuff. Here we see the nice section from Dolmen here. You can see here the whole row of doors for 5 of the cells on one side. Here's the passageway. There's some benches actually in the passageway here, which has suggested to me that maybe some of the times the poor men were sort of confined out here, and only the more important people got into the chapel, who knows. And then there's some nice 17th century furniture which still survives being shown on the fine room on the upper floor as well. So that's just a reminder then about how that ground floor worked. In terms of the overall circulation, the main entrance control obviously was the main gate, which got shut at night and so on, as we were hearing. It's rather curious the way that this passageway works, whether it's just a sort of buffering space between the dormitory and the chapel. It's clearly, this doorway was used by the warden, confrater and so on, and others who would maybe be coming into the chapel, coming around through the grand entrance separate from the dormitory, coming around this way and into the chapel itself. But there's a doorway here also that lets onto the terrace, and whether that was just to allow the old folks to sun themselves on the terrace. It does face south and is a nice sitting out space really, but difficult to fathom that. There's a view of it there, and you can see it doesn't have straight access into that terraced area. There's then the fine porch. This rebuilt, but actually seems to have been rather sort of faithfully and accurately rebuilt, though it's gained itself a new statue of the founder holding his hospital. Very nice medieval thing, but that dates from 1870. But there may well have been something like that previously, and that, of course, you know, the founder and that whole benevolence of the great donor founder is really quite a major part of these medieval establishments, isn't it? Wanted now to just reflect then a little bit on the sort of wider context of hospitals, and just a little bit of setting Browne's with this the way it was set up and its infirmary hall plan in the wider context. As I said, this infirmary hall plan was something that goes right back to the 12th century, and this is one of the great classic examples, very famous example from Angers in France from the 1180s. Tremendous great thing here, sort of multi-aisle building, and it has this nice engraving of it, which showed just these curtained off partitions. So it was very much of a communal living space and directly leading directly onto a chapel at the east end. Here's an example which does make the connection to English churches rather directly, because it's become a church, but actually Ramsey in Peterborough started life as a late 12th century hospital. This was the dormitory, probably curtained off beds in the aisles here, and a chapel at the east end, which has now become the nave and chancel of the church. And one of the famous examples, which I visited quite some years ago with the Vernacular Architecture Group, St Mary's in Chichester, this wonderful aisled timber frame building from the late 13th century. There's a nice drawing of it there by Julian Munby, again with curtained off beds in the aisles, and the chapel at the east end, very much of that sort of religious monastic feeling establishment. And this remarkably survives. I'm not quite sure whether it's still in this state, but this had been, the cells here had been built up and enclosed with brick and chimneys added and so on and so forth, but still survived. Okay, then moving on to a different sort of plan. Here what's happened is that in the St John's Hospital in Northampton, originally there was probably a chapel and an infirmary hall here with the dormitory, but when it was rebuilt in the early 14th century, it was then rebuilt with a more separate thing, so that one's getting some distance between the hall and the chapel, and here a somewhat more separated out accommodation with a small hall in the space there. No direct link now to the chapel, unlike the rather old-fashioned way it was still preserved at Browne's Hospital. And then ultimately, of course, and this is a very early example from Elm, Oxfordshire in 1437, here an establishment for 13 poor men who all now had separate rooms around a courtyard, each one of them with a fireplace heating it and so on, really quite luxurious accommodation compared with Browne's Hospital 50 years later. And the passageway here links off to the church and so on, but no adjoining chapel. And here there's a school as well that's associated with it as well. Another interesting example in nearby in Northamptonshire at Higham Ferrers is another old-fashioned infirmary hall, really here, but here with a large hall heated by an original fireplace, rather smaller chapel, and a rather fine school also adjoining. This was founded in 1423 by Henry Chichely, who came from Higham Ferrers, became Archbishop of Canterbury, and then in that way set up a fine establishment as benefactor in his own birth town. This was for 12 men, 1 woman, had cubicles and partitions which have now gone. That's it there. Rather nice, characteristic Northamptonshire striped stonework with the chapel here and so again an infirmary hall plan, but here with the added luxury of a fireplace. So I wanted now to move on to the upstairs. So this is the fine staircase within that staircase block that we looked leading up to the upper room. And we go on up here, and here's the upper room. We've looked at the double height space of the chapel, so that's separate really. So you're coming up the stairs. There's then this nowadays this sort of passage area entry, a fine large room called the audit room, and what became the confrater's space. So this became a space in the later centuries for where the confrater, the assistant warden, his accommodation was there. But as we'll see, that doesn't seem to have been the case originally. We'll just look at a few features in this space. It really is rather a fine room, this, and remarkably well preserved once again. A fine timber stud wall that's dividing it from the chapel, so there were no doorways through. The doorway goes through now into that gallery that was inserted, but originally that was the end wall. Some fine windows. This, although the fireplace is later here, there was always a fireplace, a chimney stack built, very nice roof structure. Still survives, that cambered roof and leaded slope pitches. Very large windows lighting the space. It's got rather later now, but some very nice 17th century original furniture, original to the building, with some of the warden's names on it and so on. Here's the space coming around. You'll see this interesting timber cornice feature between the windows here, which we'll look at again in a minute. Some very fine glass once again. Remarkably fine, really, for this sort of space. And there's Thomas Stokes's crest of the Stork up above that one there. And as we said, the fireplace, and then this cornice arrangement, which clearly was made to receive hangings. So here's a sort of end stop to that cornice. There must have been little fixings to be able to put up wall hangings, whether these were sort of permanent or whether they were put up for particular events. We don't really know, but there are other fine feature. So all of this space is, it seems, rather too grand, really, to be somewhere for the 10 poor men and 2 poor women. Lowly, devout and poor. It's useful to look at other hospitals for comparison about sort of what they did for a shared hall space for their poor men. In early infirmary halls, like the one we were seeing at Chichester, the timber aisled hall, it seems the central space served as the dining area with an open central hearth. And others in late medieval houses, like almshouses like Kyme Ferrers, had a relatively small space within the, just had that one volume within the space, really, for living and dining in. A contract in Saltzman's wonderful documentary history gives another example for a timber framed hospital for 13 bedesmen at Tattershall, built in 1485, which has a modest hall with bed chambers over it and a fireplace. So that's the sort of accommodation you'd be looking for in hospital at this time. So the new analysis that Alan Rogers and I did, combined with the documentary research, shows that this space was originally built not as part of the hospital, but for use of the guild, the All Saints Guild, of which William Browne was also the alderman, and it was a guild space. He was alderman of that religious guild. There's rather little known about the guild except for the records of a lawsuit, which we'll come on to, which came to a head in 1506, sometime after Browne's death in 1489. By that time, the warden of the hospital and the alderman of the guild had fallen out, and they had a long and bitter dispute. And interestingly, they sort of, it's as ever, really, you get these snippets, don't you, of information when things come to the law courts, and you get the records made. The warden claimed that the alderman pretendeth unto the hall, buttery, pantry and kitchen of the almshouse, and had no right to use them. So clearly the alderman felt that this was the guild's hall. By now, with William Browne gone as the chief of the guild, the hospital was seeing it as being their space. And at one stage of the dispute, it's even recorded that the warden paid for a padlock to be put on the pantry door, and an inventory was taken of the guild's goods and so on. So they were really sort of quite fierce dispute. The court case dragged on. The outcome isn't known, frustratingly, but it does show that William Browne had a dual role, really. William Browne, sorry, had a dual role as a patron of the hospital and alderman of the guild. And he established this very much as a dual purpose building, not just as a hospital, but a hospital with a guild hall, which makes very much more sense of this very fine first floor hall, the guild hall. So just to fill in the story a little bit about guild halls, again, they're a sort of very specific type of use which has been researched, though not so much as hospitals, really. Kate Giles has done quite a lot of work on guild halls especially, a rather different communal living space. The key function of guild halls was for the guild meetings, the great feasts and ceremonial occasions, and that was really why you had such a grand hall, just a rather occasional use really, held periodically maybe throughout the year. And it was a highly ritualized occasion. I'm using here to give a sense of that. Very much, this is my drawings from Oakham Castle, very much a grander medieval hall, but it gives a sense of the way in which guild halls function very much as a sort of elite halls also, with a high table for the most important people, a whole procession, a whole ritual of how meals were taken, and so on, and a hierarchy of who sat where. So it followed that same hierarchy with a low end, a cross passage often, a buttery, pantry, kitchen, all of those sorts of things. And this is a familiar thing from the lateral psalter, showing that high table and the service at the high table in the hall. And guild feasts and guild halls would have had very much the same sort of pattern and ritual to them as that. So just again, just touching base really with the typical medieval hall. This is a really rather fine surviving example, just very nice to fit this in. It's a wonderful building that I've studied in some detail, Northborough Manor near Peterborough, privately owned house, very fine building built from early 14th century. You can see the big double height space of the hall there, and the doorway of the cross passage over here, and this is the service end chamber block here, and that's inside the hall, which has been restored as a grand hall with a classic set of 3 service doorways, the cross passage and so on. And here there's the platform here, it's lost the chamber at the high end, but the cross passage dais here, and the stair leading up to what would have been the principal chamber. So coming back to our plan of Browne's Hospital, it's remarkable how, with that as the sort of pattern, one can start fitting it in. And coming up obviously onto the first floor here, and to some extent some of this woodwork has been renewed, and one needs to look carefully at what original details there are. But we have a sort of passage entryway here into a fine large room where there's large windows. There's an additional large window at this end of the building, which would have surely thrown light onto the dais, a lateral fireplace here warming the room. And interestingly, at the low end, as it were, here, the fireplace is a later insertion, but what you do have is these 2 small windows here, which suggests very strongly that this would have been a buttery and pantry with a division here, and it would have acted as 2 service rooms. And we know from the documents that there was a pantry, because that was on this argument about locking up the guild's inventory of silver plate and so on in there. And interestingly as well, through this space, one leads through into this connecting passageway through here. We'll see a little bit more of that in a moment. So this is now standing inside that entry space and looking into the hall. There's now, although sort of somewhat reframed in the 17th century, but sort of a screens entry, as you see in 16th and 17th century halls, with 2 doorways into it, very much of that hall pattern. Here we're looking at what became the confraters room, but these 2 small windows, and I'm suggesting there would have been a central passage, partition here dividing the buttery and pantry, and then this door leading out through to what I'm suggesting would have been the kitchen passageway coming in from that service end there. And there's a view looking at the end gable of the building with those 2 windows here, and we would have had originally a first floor passageway coming across here. This is we're very lucky to have a few of these early photographs which show this. So this here, this is now the main hall is over here. Coming through that doorway, there's this curious, rather sort of corridor leading across into this block, which is all gone, and which somewhere I think would have been the kitchen serving those guild feasts, and this would have been the processional route as we're used to in other secular ordinary hall buildings. So there we go. The overall view then see, we wanted to look at the yes, the overall plan here. So we've then got this part now lost, but we've now got this passageway leading out at first floor level into this rear block here, and all of this then swept away the first floor. So just now I wanted to look a little bit at the surviving building and our evidence for that. As I say, the dual purpose of the building does now really make a lot more sense of the overall building design. As I said, there's been some people have even questioned whether this isn't some sort of two-phase building because of the sort of strange way that the windows and the spaces relate to each other. But actually, with a bit of understanding here, we have that regular set of small windows, a double height space for the chapel, and then the whole emphasis is on this ground first floor. So we've got three large windows for the main hall space, the Guildhall space. Here, a large window lighting the entryway and so on. This one actually lighting that the passageway and over the rood screen and so on. So it does start to make sense a lot more as a building overall. Right, so although the building, all of this rear part is rebuilt in 1870, we do have these drawings and a few historic photographs, and with some reference to the archives as well, we are able still to get a picture of this overall complete establishment of the hospital. There's an open court here, and here we have the warden's block, warden's house we'll be looking at here, halls and so on, and then some spaces out beyond. So we're going to look at those in a little bit more detail. This is looking then within the court. We've got the main hospital surviving on our right here, and this is the warden's house, which actually fits together remarkably well from the plan and from the surviving evidence. You get a very complete picture of it with a hall, a service end over here, a parlour beyond the hall, chambers up above, and so on. And also, interestingly, what seemed to be, looking at the evidence, original fireplaces in most of the rooms. The warden wasn't short of fuel and fire to keep warm, even if the beadsman had a rather thinner time of it. And then over on the other side here is this block, which had the for the confrater, and also, as we'll see, for the beadsman itself, because piecing this together, here we go, you can see the warden's house. Been talking here with the hall, parlour and service are sort of legible here, and the stairs up to chambers above. Here we've got labelled up as the warden's kitchen here, and interestingly, this space over here called the nurse's kitchen. These are the 19th century uses now, but one is able, I think, to put together a reasonably convincing plan that this was originally the common hall of the beadsman, because obviously, having eliminated the fine first floor hall as being the Guildhall and not generally in use in the medieval period to the beadsman, we're looking for a space where they could warm themselves by a fire, really, and have their cooking done and so on. And that seems to be this hall space here, which if we go on again, we can see the space. Sorry, I'm just trying to find that photograph again. Yeah, there we go. So this window here is a double height window on the original photographs, and seems to light a whole hall space that's then subsequently been subdivided. Interestingly, that sort of makes sense because, for example, there's a nice reference at Latham's Hospital in 1597 in Handel, Northamptonshire. There was only one fireplace in the common hall, and the regulations actually stated that each inmate should warm themselves in turn before the fire. So that looks like maybe where they spent a lot of their time, rather than in the cold dormitory and so on. Maybe they were sort of chatting by the fireside during much of their time. So, and then finally, just looking at the space beyond It's interesting. This has probably been repurposed and rebuilt, so we've now got a brew house, a wash house, and so on here. But this does seem probably to have been a series of supporting buildings referenced in the documents. There was a stable here, there was a cape and pen, a well, and interestingly, a sort of hangover, there was a separate garden, separate still garden. This is the warden's garden here, and there's definite sort of subdivision of space, and this is the beadsman's garden, and that probably replicates the original medieval arrangement. Obviously, there would have been privies at the back here always, and so on. And interestingly also, although there's no evidence of this now on the plan or anything else other than the reference in the archive, Browne also established a school on this site. He really did have really quite a high level of ambition, rather like places like Ulm or Higham Ferrers, where the school was, it was founded by the Archbishop of Canterbury alongside the hospital there. So remarkably complete establishment. And then I think the last slides are really just sort of saying what happened. So all of this rear part was rebuilt in 1870, and this is now still an active almshouse. The people, the old people live here, and nowadays still 12 people, 12 accommodation units around this courtyard built in that 1870 period. But when I was doing this study, interestingly, the proportion of people had changed from 10 men and 2 women to being 11 women, and this was the one man, David Goodinson, who was my great chap who used to allow me in and show me round. So that's the last slide. Thank you very much. I'll maybe stop sharing at that point, should I? Okay.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. I'm here, but I still can't see myself. That was a fascinating talk. Thank you, Nick, so much. I kept thinking of the great hospital here in Norwich, which is sort of just below where I live, really.
Yes.
With its row of cells, but on the upper story of the church itself.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
But those little cubicles and so on, and the poor women who are there to look after the poor old pilgrims or poor priests or whoever they were. I'm not quite sure who the residents were, but they had to be over the age of 50, I think.
Right. Yes.
And plainly dressed and so on. So no chance of hanky panky or anything. Anyway.
Yes.